The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
Union by their bosses. The right-wing clockmakers and the socialist fakers are making by the wankers double crosses. The Hillquits, the Bitsky's and the Thomases are making by the wakers false promises. They preach socialism, but they practice fascism to preserve capitalism by their bosses. Ooh-ha.
Welcome again today, folks, to another episode of Political Gingervitis, the zany and goofy podcast for progressives. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and today we're going to start right off with a little news from the future, because we have again here today my time tuner, which is going to allow me to talk to myself in the future. So I'll just flip it on now, and I will turn the dials, and I will be able to communicate with myself now in the future. So, hello again, Andrew in the future.
Hello again, Andrew in the past.
So, what can we expect in the future for President Trump's plan with Social Security?
Well, here's the deal. Every month now, we have the Social Security Department send out their monthly allocation of keynote tickets, and those are sent to retirees. Then the drawing is held on the first Tuesday of the month, and it leads to thousands of senior citizens piling into every bar and $5 Pizza Hut within walking distance of a pharmacy. This is how senior citizens in Trump's America are getting by.
What a lovely prospect.
The subject is the American personality Zsa Gabor.
I did a show, and Zsa Zsa was on the show. Now, that's a name that doesn't require a last name anymore. It's like Shaw or Shakespeare. And one of the questions asked was, could you love a man if you didn't have any money? And she stood up and she said, oh, yes, I could love a man if he didn't have any money, didn't have any jewels, didn't have any possessions of any kind. If I loved him, I would marry him if he had nothing. She sat down and I stood up and I said, Zsa Zsa, that's the finest piece of fiction since The Tale of Two Cities.
They asked him about women drivers.
Women are much better drivers. And I'll tell you why. It's because when a woman is driving, she looks straight ahead. The man is looking on every corner and see if there's a dame there that looks attractive.
Don't the women look to see if the men are attractive?
No. Most of the attractive men are in automobiles.
Next up, we have Professor Gerald Horne, an acclaimed historian and writer on the history of African Americans and their struggles in honor of Black History Month 2017. What do you believe are the main currents and contours of African American history in terms of how the struggle against white supremacy has evolved?
From the beginning of the 20th century, I would say the struggle against white supremacy has been dominated by a number of trends. Part of the trend has been exemplified by Booker T. Washington, who, as you know, was a leading figure in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, a founder of Tuskegee Institute, a leading university that still exists in Alabama, a man who caused controversy when he dined in the White House with then U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, but a man who also caused controversy in the 1890s when he gave a speech that was widely interpreted as calling for a kind of accommodation with Jim Crow and sort of trying to take Jim Crow and make the best of it. So therefore, you don't necessarily struggle, overtly at least, for the right to vote or to desegregate leading institutions. Perhaps you should struggle to build your own. Now, that kind of thinking has had a resurgence in recent years as the United States has turned to the right. Another trend is exemplified by the founders of the NAACP, the oldest and largest civil rights organization to this very day, founded in 1909, which fought for the right to vote and fought for desegregation at the highest levels of U.S. society. Of course, is symbolized by its founder and chief spokesperson for over 25 years, W.E.B. Du Bois, born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts in 1868, passing away in 1963 in West Africa, where he had sought exile and citizenship. And of course, he dies on the eve of the March on Washington in 1963, which catapulted Martin Luther King into prominence. And of course, there's a moment of silence for the death of Dr. Du Bois in Washington in 1963. Now, you probably know that Du Bois, in 1961, when he was 93 years old, joined the U.S. Communist Party, which represents a third trend, that's to say a socialist-oriented trend. I guess Du Bois is a leading exemplar, but so is Paul Robeson, whose biography I've just written, and so was William Patterson, who I wrote a biography about, who, of course, helped to influence Paul Robeson to the left. That particular trend has suffered grievously, not least after the U.S. disrupted the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, that is, say, the 1941-1945 alliance that defeated the Axis powers, Berlin and Tokyo, and embarked upon the Red Scare, which led to a marginalizing, if not crushing, of socialist-oriented thought for years to come. And then another trend would be exemplified by kind of black nationalist trend. I guess most exemplified by Marcus Garvey or Malcolm X, for example. I have a book coming out soon which deals with the little-known history of that trend. That is to say that many within that trend were pro-Tokyo up until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Japan has made overt move to propagandize black Americans and to woo black Americans. In fact, it's not just the nationalists. In the period before 1945, Japan was probably the nation most admired generally by black Americans, and Du Bois, Garvey, and Booker T. Washington all spoke favorably about Japan. And that trend, of course, is still with us and still prominent to this very day.
So, you've recently published a new book titled Confronting Black Jacobins. Can you first describe what the original C.L.R. James book dealt with, and then what your title is dealing with?
The Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James, over 55 years ago, published a book, The Black Jacobins, which is still considered a leading text on the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, the first successful slave revolt, perhaps in world history, that transformed the institution of slavery, leading to its ultimate demise. My book deals with the United States, the Haitian Revolution, and the origins of the Dominican Republic. That's the subtitle of the book. And it puts forth a thesis that in terms of understanding abolition in North America, you have to understand the Haitian Revolution because it ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its ultimate collapse. The Haitian Revolution, of course, attracted the interest and the interference of all the leading powers. France was the leading colonial power on the island of Hispaniola in August 1791. But keep in mind that there is an intimate connection between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. That is to say that the French helped to fund the rebels led by George Washington, as payback to their eternal antagonists across the Channel, speaking of London. And that was pivotal in terms of the creation of the United States of America. However, two results ensued. One, France had to go into debt in order to fund these rebels, which helped to ignite the French Revolution in July 1789. And second, the United States, despite all the claims about it being the city on the hill, this great beacon of liberty, actually, after the triumph of the United States, it became the leading slave trading nation. And in fact, began to deposit Africans on the shores of Hispaniola at a record clip, which created a demographic imbalance in favor of the Africans, sometimes outnumbering the Europeans in certain precincts 30-1, providing favorable conditions for a slave revolt, which then ensued in August 1791 and triumphed in 1804, January 1. Now, the leading powers tried to crush the Haitian Revolution, Britain not least, but then Britain suffered one of the most severe and ignominious defeats in its long colonial history, and suddenly realized that with regard to slavery and the slave trade, the jig was up. So by 1807, it had moved to abolish the slave trade and then began to put pressure on its rival, the United States of America, to do the same, abolish slavery in 1833, 1834, began to put pressure on its rival, the United States, to do the same, entered into a de facto entente with independent Haiti, which tried to execute a kind of pincers movement against the slaveholders' republic, speaking of the United States of America. This kind of pressure ultimately ensued with the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, leading to the freedom of the enslaved in North America. Now, before that, in 1844, the United States, because of its hostility and antagonism towards Haiti, helped to induce the secession of the eastern part of the island, now the Dominican Republic, from Haiti, which Haiti had been ruling for a number of decades. This led to an interminable conflict between the two nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which still manifests to this very day. You probably know about the crisis on the border between Haiti and the DR, on the island of Hispaniola, where darker-skinned people in particular are being expelled from the DR on the faulty premise that they are not DR nationals, they are in fact Haitians. So in any case, that is some of what my book deals with.
So the late Gore Vidal describes the American reaction to the Haitian Revolution in his historical novel Burr as not unlike a Red Scare that America has periodically been host to during the past 150 years. Do you think that is a correct framing of the issue, or would you differ with his treatment of the matter, and how?
Well, with regard to that statement, I think he's spot on. He's right on the money. I think that if you look at anti-communism, part of the hysteria that helped to generate anti-communism was precisely the idea that the communists were going to engage in uncompensated expropriation of private property. That's what animated anti-communism. If you look at the Haitian Revolution, you also saw the uncompensated expropriation of private property. That's to say, when the slaves were freed, the slave owners, at least in North America, were not compensated. Now, of course, we know that by the 1820s, the Haitians were forced to pay reparations to the slave owners from France who owned Africans. But the hysteria about uncompensated expropriation of private property is one of the animating principles of history of the past 2 centuries. And the quicker we begin to understand that, the better we'll be, and the better we'll understand the strength of the right wing, not least in North America.
The abolitionist John Brown launched his famous raid on Harper's Ferry after having studied the Haitian Revolt. Can you speak to how the Haitian events further influenced the American abolitionist movement?
Well, first of all, on the island of Hispaniola, there were abolitionist societies, as I talk about in the book, that are in direct contact with abolitionists in the United States of America. Second of all, you may recall that in 1804, at the time of the triumph of the Haitian Revolution, the eastern side of the island was still controlled by Spain. It wasn't until 1822 that the Haitian regime marched in and expelled the Spanish, which was then a weakening force globally, that is to say, the Spanish. At that point, the Haitians began to try to attract free Negroes from the United States to bolster their rule and regime in the island of Hispaniola, and the free Negroes from the United States responded with alacrity and eagerness. It's estimated that thousands, perhaps 13,000, migrated there. They brought their abolitionist sentiments with them and became sort of a bee in the bonnet of the U.S. slaveholding republic. And you can't understand the slave revolts that mark the first few decades of the 19th century without understanding the Haitian Revolution, because they have Haitian fingerprints all over them. I'm speaking of Gabriel's Revolt in Virginia, circa 1800, Bigmore Vesey's in South Carolina, circa 1821. Recall that Vesey Revolt was actually planned in the AME church that was the scene of the massacre of black parishioners in June 2015 in Charleston. In fact, after the planning of the 1821 revolt, that church was razed and destroyed until it was rebuilt years later. And then the Nat Turner Revolt, circa 1831 in Virginia, has Haitian fingerprints all over it. And it's interesting that when John Brown was killed, there was mourning in Haiti. There's a major avenue in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, named after John Brown to this very day. So certainly John Brown is a revered figure in Haiti.
You differ with C.L.R. James in regards to how you view the American events of 1776. Could you briefly explain why you feel 1776 was a counter-revolution?
Well, because the short answer is that 1776 was driven in no small part by the desire to evade incipient British abolitionism. That is to say, 1776 was not unlike the unilateral Declaration of Independence in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in November 1965, where a white minority regime was trying to evade the logic of one person, one vote. And decolonization, 1776 was an attempt to evade the logic of abolition of slavery. 1776 was a classic settlers' revolt, not unlike what befell Algeria in the 1950s. The difference between Algeria and the United States, what is now the United States, is that the settlers in North America prevailed and the settlers in Algeria did not. And as I say in the 1776 book, there's something to be said for victor's history. That is to say, if you win, you tend to get a better press than if you lose for some strange reason, although I'm sure you can figure out why. In that 1776 book, I also go far beyond 1776. The book actually begins in the late 17th century with the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688 in what is now London, where you have the monarch taking a step back in favor of the rising merchant class, and this is reflected in the African slave trade, as the Royal African Company, theretofore under the thumb of the monarch, takes a step back in terms of opening up or deregulating, if you like, the African slave trade, allowing in the merchant class into this lucrative enterprise. They descend upon the continent of Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight, dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean, because at that point, the Caribbean was seen as more profitable than the North American mainland. However, the difficulty with the Caribbean, once again, was the demographics. That is to say that in Jamaica, in particular, you had not only a sizable black population, but you also had a sizable maroon population. In fact, when the English take the island of Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, a force that had to be contended with already was the maroon population, or the independent African population, if you like. Because of all the slave revolts that are taking place in the Caribbean, not least because of demographics, you see a great trek from the Caribbean to the North American mainland. And I choose the term great trek intentionally. It's meant to evoke the great trek of South African history, whereby after Britain abolishes slavery throughout the empire in 1833, the nation that we now know as South Africa had originally been settled by the Dutch in 1652, who we now refer to as the Boers. They had been enslaving Africans. They wanted to continue enslaving Africans, so they began to move north from the Cape Colony into what is now the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, etc. So once again, I'm drawing a parallel with African history. That is to say, you had a great trek from the Caribbean to the North American mainland, but that does not rescue the enslavers, because you still have slave revolts, such as in 1739 in Stono, South Carolina, probably the bloodiest slave revolt in English colonial history. That, of course, was assisted by the Spanish then occupying Florida, and the Spanish are taking a different position with regard to arming Africans. And in fact, it's probably true, as a matter of fact, this is what I write, that armed Africans helped to ignite the Stonos revolt. Indeed, because the Spanish were jousting successfully with the English and the British throughout the Americas for control by dint of use of armed Africans, London decided that the best colonial practice included arming Africans, but this was enraging and infuriating the settlers, particularly in the U.S., what is now the U.S. South, but I would say throughout the so-called 13 colonies, because they thought Africans were only good for being marched at gunpoint into the fields to pick cotton or to engage in unpaid labor, not to be soldiers. And so this deepens the rift between London and the settlers. The rift does not cease when, during the 7 Years' War, 1757 to 1763, 1756 to 1763, London had routed the French from Canada, leaving, of course, as we know, the lingering national question in Quebec, mostly French-speaking to this very day, and routing the Spanish from Florida, trying to save the settlers in South Carolina and Georgia from another kind of Stonos revolt. Of course, what happens is that the settlers then engage in double dealing. They go behind the back of London, cut deals with the recently defeated French and Spanish, not least because London wanted to raise taxes to pay for the 7 Years' War. And then, by dint of that support from Paris and Madrid, the settlers successfully revolt against London and established the United States of America. That's basically, in short, the thesis of my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776.
Excellent. You just mentioned earlier that you wrote a book, a biography of the great Paul Robeson. Could you explain what you think young people today might learn from Robeson's life and his struggles?
Well, first of all, in terms of political people in particular, I think one thing you learn from Robeson's life is that it's very important to struggle, but it's also important to study. You know, Robeson knew many, many different languages. I think that was one of the reasons why he was such a global figure. I mean, he could go to Norway and speak to the Norwegians in their language and sing to them in their language. He could go to France and do the same thing. He could go to certain parts of Africa and do the same thing. He could speak Spanish, so he could speak to the Spanish-speaking people of the United States. But this did not come magically. I mean, he didn't have a silicon chip in his brain that he inserted so he could speak these languages. He studied. And I think that's one of the lessons you learn from the life of Paul Robeson, born in New Jersey in 1898, passing away in 1976, in between being a leading student at Rutgers University, All-American athlete, a graduate of Columbia University Law School, and a lawyer for a brief period of time, but mostly renowned because of his magnificent singing voice, his acting skills, probably the leading star of stage and screen in Hollywood, in the United States entertainment industry in the 1920s and 1930s. Although in the 1920s and 1930s, he was mostly living in London, which is another theme. I think that Black Americans in particular, because of the rancid white supremacy that predominates in leading circles here, oftentimes have had to go into exile to achieve and attain a certain kind of eminence. And that was certainly true for Robeson. He returns to North America, however, in 1939 as World War II is erupting, and he helps to rally the blacks who, as noted, many of whom were pro-Tokyo, and rally labor against the Axis powers, but he's repaid after the war ends with the United States persecuting him because he would not renounce socialism or the socialist project. His income plummets from the 6 figures to the 4 figures. His passport is taken. He's, quote, blacklisted, unquote, difficult to get employment or to pursue his career. And so finally, international pressure caused the United States to return his passport. He immediately jets off to London to resume his career. But his health is deteriorating. And so he returns to the United States in 1965 as basically a recluse until he passed away in January 1976.
So Dr. Tony Montero has previously said there's something to the black radical tradition that because it begins as a repudiation of slavery as a form of capitalism, that makes the current anti-capitalist. And you've previously written a biography of Ben Davis, the Communist Party politician. Can you perhaps elaborate on this anti-capitalist and class-based approach to anti-racism and how the Communist Party dealt with racism in America, and in turn how African Americans responded to the growth of the Communist Party?
Well, first of all, I think you can understand the takeoff of capitalism without understanding slavery. That's the thesis put forward by the great Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, and it's how Europe underdeveloped Africa. That's a thesis that was expanded upon by Eric Williams, the Trinidadian intellectual in Capitalism and Slavery, published over 70-odd years ago. That's a thesis expanded upon by the Nigerian historian, now at the University of Rochester, Joseph Corey, on his book on the Industrial Revolution in England. So it's not surprising that those of us whose ancestors formed the fuel for the rise of capitalism are not necessarily warm and fuzzy towards that particular socioeconomic formation, speaking of capitalism. This has led to the reality that a significant number of black intellectuals, not only in the United States, but also, as the example of Rodney and Williams suggests, C.L.R. James, the example of the South African Communist Party suggests, which has been ruling South Africa in alliance with the ANC, the African National Congress, since 1994. There's been a very strong anti-capitalist trend within the Pan-African community, not least in the United States of America. You mentioned Ben Davis. You could have mentioned Shirley Graham Du Bois, Claudia Jones, William L. Patterson, Ferdinand Smith, Hosea Hudson, all of whom had varying relationships with the U.S. Communist Party, which, prompted by Moscow, by the way, took a strong position against racism and white supremacy, up to and including the creation of a black republic, although it should be noted that the idea of a black republic was not solely the creation of Moscow. I mean, keep in mind, look at the history of Oklahoma, now a state in the United States. It was originally created as a land for the Native Americans. And you might recall that promise to the Native Americans was reneged on, like so many other promises to the Native Americans. You know about the University of Oklahoma, their football team is called the Sooners, and their athletic teams are called the Sooners. That's because in 1889, Indian Territory, that is, Oklahoma, was opened up to so-called white settlement, and the Sooners were those who jumped the gun and ran to claim Native American land before you were supposed to. And then, of course, Oklahoma becomes a state in the United States in 1907. So this idea of an independent black republic, contrary to the anti-communist historians, whose scope obviously is not very broad, was not solely the creation of Moscow. And indeed, as I talk about in my book, Black and Brown, African American Mexican Revolution, there was a plot, the Plan of San Diego, which is a staple of Chicano history, by the way, which involved retaking the land seized from Mexico in 1846 in the War of Aggression, and then establishing independent black and Native American republics on that land. So there was a long history of breaking up the United States in various ways that did not come solely from Moscow. I mean, these are part of the problem with these historians. They tend to have tunnel vision. They'll look at, how people tied their shoelaces between 1787 and 1788, and then that's all they'll study. Or they'll look at, like, Moscow and the U.S. Communist Party and not look beyond that tunnel, which might help to inform them otherwise, surprisingly enough. So in any event, you should know that the U.S. Communist Party, particularly when the blacks had significant influence, used to put white members on trial for white chauvinism, something that the Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences might want to consider, given this white backlash against the idea of diversifying that particular institution that awards the Oscars. So that's just a snapshot of some of the leading points.
One of the more famous portrayals in American literature of the Communist Party treatment of these issues is from Richard Wright in his novel Native Son and his contribution to the anti-communist anthology The God That Failed. How should today's activists confront, process, and digest this current of anti-communism that can still be found in cases like that of Dr. Montero?
Well, I think they should take it with a grain of salt. Keep in mind that Richard Wright, the great black novelist born in Mississippi, 1908, dies in France in 1960 at the tender age of 52. But as he was passing away, he was moving away from anti-communism. Look at the writings of Ollie Harrington, a former staff member of the NAACP, a noted cartoonist of the left who went into exile in East Berlin during the height of the Cold War and was in touch with Wright in France, and reports that Wright was not only moving away from his anti-communism, but that might help to account for the suspicious circumstances surrounding his sudden passing at the age of 52. But in any case, I would hope that in 2016, given the crisis in the United States and perhaps an impending presidency of Donald J. Trump with Sarah Palin being Secretary of State, that folks would have enough sense to discard tired anti-communism, a relic of the Cold War, and open their eyes to what's going on in the world before we all wind up in a concentration camp in Fenway Park in Boston.
The great W.E.B. Du Bois was skeptical about the black belt theory and remained for a time with the NAACP until he later joined the party. What illustrated this development in his thinking?
Well, I mean, if you look at it's funny, I was just down in University of Southern Mississippi looking at the papers of Theodore Bilbo, the man, as he called himself, probably the prime minister of Jim Crow, served as both governor and U.S. senator from the Magnolia State. And interestingly enough, some of the best records of black nationalists from the 1930s are found in the papers of Theodore Bilbo because he was working with them on a plan to resettle Negroes in Africa. Although I should mention parenthetically, they may not have been aware that some of Bilbo's comrades had the idea that after the black population was weakened in North America, they'd move in to sterilize all the women and then repeal the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which of course means the amendments abolishing slavery, bringing equal protection under the law and the right to vote. But there were also comrades and black nationalists who had the idea of the United States settling Negroes in a Negro state and then sparsely populated Southern California east of Los Angeles and western Arizona, for example. So once again, this idea, people have to get it through their heads, that this idea of a black republic, it wasn't just a Communist Party idea. I mean, a lot of people were talking about that. A lot of people talk about it today. Of course, what happened is that the NAACP engaged in very effective counter-propaganda by associating the Communist Party idea of a black republic with separate but equal and Jim Crow ideas and ideas of Senator Theodore Bilbo. And the ideas got caught up in that maelstrom, which I think helped to lead the Communist Party to move away from that idea in circa 1957, just as the Martin Luther King-led movement is erupting.
One figure that's constantly used as a cudgel against leftists, and we even see it now arising in the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, is the figure of Joseph Stalin. But what is not articulated is how people of color felt about him. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, as I say in my Robeson book, it's very interesting. In the United States, Stalin is considered to be a demonic figure, except between 1941 and 1945, when he's a hero. I mean, that is to say, if you look at the Hollywood movies that depict Stalin, like Mission to Moscow, which you might be able to find on YouTube, he's portrayed as this heroic figure, much beloved by his people. And it's very interesting that nobody, other than Pat Buchanan and Herbert Hoover, there are few who criticize the United States and President Roosevelt for allying with Stalin to defeat their antagonists in Berlin and Tokyo. But Black Americans like Robeson, who felt the need to ally with Stalin to defeat their antagonists, they're excoriated, called the dupes, etc. Now, certainly, I'd be the last person to try to make excuses for human rights violations that Stalin's comrades charged them with. But I do think this whole Stalin thing is really, it lacks proportion. And it's a double standard, because until people start criticizing the United States for allying with Stalin between 1941 and 1945, well, then they should revise their thinking.
Are there any points you would like to bring up or communicate to listeners as part of Black History Month, and things that should be thought about as this Black Lives Matters movement continues to evolve and develop?
Well, I would only say what I said before, that it's necessary to struggle and it's necessary to study. I mean, we have to be perpetual strugglers and perpetual students. And in terms of students, it's important not to get bogged down in a lot of nonsense. I mean, I was reading the New York Times book review this morning and reading about all these books being written about the U.S. right wing, which on the one hand is good, except that there's not that much insight into the U.S. right wing by these writers. And so I was thinking to myself, well, you know, somebody who picks up that book is basically wasting their time. So it's important to study, to have a proper syllabus when you proceed to study. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes.
Mrs. Richter,
Who wants to know?
Trotsky, Bronstein, the pen.
Welcome, comrade. I'm M. Never forget the forms. We heard you were on your way, but I can't pretend we were expecting you exactly.
Comrade, would you be so good as to pay the cabbie for me? Seems to be having difficulty making himself understood.
On the next floor, the first door on the right.
Comrade Lenin. Trotsky, the pen.
Trotsky? I thought you were Bronstein.
Bronstein I got tired of. Trotsky I borrowed from a jailer just before I escaped. You think it suits?
You have a letter? Something?
Of course.
Welcome to London, comrade.
It's an honor to be here, Comrade Lenin. I'm entirely in your hands. Tell me what I can do.
C, you're a cutie full of charm. D, you're a darling, and E, you're exciting, and F, you're a feather in my arms. G, you look good to me. H, you're so heavenly. I, you're the one I idolize. J, we're like Jack and Jill. K, you're so kissable. L is the love light in your eyes. The duty of the revolutionary is to fight those forces and personalities which impede or obstruct the socialist revolution.
That's what I said.
No, it isn't what you said, and you must see the difference. The future is less than 6 months away. We make the future with every new theory we evolve, every organizational change we set in progress. There will be no revolution. Millions will not be mobilized against the Tsarist state unless we make it possible. We are Marxists. We understand, as the anarchists and liberals cannot,
the nature of power of the state and so on, but it is not enough to know the world. We must learn how to change it. And in order to do that, we must first and foremost build an organization, a party, to develop the theory and lead the revolutionary struggle. You see what I mean? Objectively, the enemy can be your best friend, your lover, your party colleague, the chairman of your local branch, the editor of your party journal. The enemy is he who impedes the course of the revolution. Oh, the battle for now, Comrade Trotsky, is not with the Tsar. It's with ourselves.
Comrade Trotsky doesn't leave soon. He'll miss Vera Ivanovna's mutton stew.
All right. Think about it.
M-N-O-P. I could go on all day. Q. Q-R-S-T. Alphabetically speaking, you're okay. You make my life complete. V means you're very sweet. Double U-X-Y-Z. It's fun to wander through the alphabet with you.
I've written 4 books. I had one out about 6 months ago called Memoirs of a Mangy Lover. Wasn't it published over here? That's the only thing that ever nettled me, when people say, who wrote the books for you? The trouble with writing a book, unless you're Chaucer or Hemingway or Sinclair Lewis or somebody like that, you have to plug the book, which means you have to go on any number of shows. Like you have to go on the Tonight Show, the Today Show, the Steve Allen Show. You have to go on all these shows for practically nothing. I hate to go on all these shows. It's kind of embarrassing to sit and talk about your own book. And as a rule, the people who operate the show haven't read the books. They quickly read a chapter or something, and they confine you to this. So by the time you go on all these shows for nothing, if you made any money on the book, you would lose money.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.